Hi, I'm Kate.
And I'm Sophie.
And in 2020 we both took part in the Growing Future Assets investment competition, researching and pitching companies that we thought were great long-term investments.
We're here to interview Amanda Young, Global Head of Responsible Investment at Aberdeen.
Amanda, thank you so much for taking time with us today. You have such an impressive job title. What does Global Head of Responsible Investment mean?
It doesn't mean I have a global head. So effectively what I'm in charge of doing is making sure that we set sustainability standards for our investments. And I have a team of people who help ensure that we can manage our sustainability funds along the lines that our clients expect of us. So that's on environmental and human rights and social issues. But we also set the standards of best practice for the companies that we are investing in. So we expect the companies we invest in to be responsible, hence the responsible investment. And what we mean by that is we mean that those companies need to think about how environmental, social and governance issues affect their business operations.
In the competition we asked the girls to look at ESG policies of different companies. Could you explain what ESG stands for?
Yes, of course. It's a terrible acronym, isn't it? ESG, environmental, social and governance issues. But I don't really like to think of it in that kind of three linear way. I much rather think about how the investments we're making, how the companies we're investing in govern themselves. So what I mean by govern is who sits on the board, who's accountable for the strategy, how is a company overseen. So that's the governance, and that will capture things like how companies remunerate their executives. So I'm sure you've seen sort of headlines of greedy executives, fat cat pay and things like that. So we as shareholders can vote against these types of remuneration policies through our voting. So that's the governance. How is a company governed? What structures do they have in place? And what do we as shareholders expect of the companies? And then it's about how they operate. So your governance structures will set the standards. These are the things that we should be looking at. But actually then there's lots of people who have to implement those standards. So how a company operates is as important as how a company governs. If we take an oil company, for instance, you've got at the top of the firm, you need to be thinking about what are our biggest environmental and social risks. You dig holes in the ground, so obviously there's a risk of oil spills. It's quite a dangerous industry, so you've got to think about health and safety of your staff. You have to think about how you're going to manage climate change risks as part of your portfolio as people move away from fossil fuels. Do you have a decarbonisation strategy? Those sorts of things. So you can have policies at the top, but then you actually need to get down into the weeds and work out how companies are managing these things. So environmental issues can cover things like climate change policies, biodiversity policies, how they use water, how they manage waste. So all range of different environmental issues. And social issues will range from things like human rights. So if you're operating in a country with a weak rule of law, you need to know that you are treating the local communities with dignity and fairly. You've seen stories of retail companies being accused of using child labour in India in factories. So how you treat your employees and how you look after things like human rights. I like to use the UN Global Compact, so that's a good thing for anyone in this competition to think about, and it covers 4 areas. These are 10 principles for companies to think about, but it covers 4 areas. The first is environment, the second is labour and employment, all companies employ people. The third is human rights, and you can think about communities, and the fourth is business ethics. So that's a real governance thing. How do we set our standards, our code of conduct, to make sure that we operate in an ethical manner?
You've already mentioned that governance is about management of a business. What type of things do you think the girls would be interested in researching about governance?
So business ethics is a good one. There's a code of conduct, bribery and corruption, how your executives treat their staff, etc. Culture, that's another good one. So what sort of culture do you set from the top of a company? How boards are structured, and specifically for the ladies, what's the diversity of a board? How many women do they have on the board? But not just about women, about age, background, education, all of the other things. So diversity is a big topic for governance experts at the moment.
Definitely.
Why is looking at what a company does in these areas important? I can see why taking care of the environment and treating staff and customers better is a good thing, but why would that matter to investors? Aren't they just interested in making money?
The two go hand in hand. So when I first started in this job, I would sit in front of a mining company and I would say to them, do you have an environmental policy? And occasionally you'd have a chief executive who would say, why do I need one of those? And no, you couldn't even think of that today, that a mining company wouldn't have an environmental policy because they are digging holes in the ground. And we only have to look at some of the big corporate scandals to see how they are intrinsically linked to environmental and social issues. So Volkswagen and the emissions scandal, they were trying to bring down their emissions and they obviously cheated in their tests in order to meet EU legislation. So legislation is an important driver for change within companies. That hit the share price, BP and the oil spill in Macondo. A very, very long time ago, Brent Spar issue with Shell, where Shell wanted to sink an oil platform in the North Sea, and there was a big activist campaign, and actually it really changed the way that Shell thought about some of these issues. So how a company operates and keeping its license to operate, i.e. being allowed to continue to operate, is important. Environmental and social issues are really important. So if you're a shareholder in these companies, it can have a direct material impact on the share price if companies behave in a poor manner.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
So if Aberdeen were looking to invest in a certain company, where would they look for information on their ESG policies and what the company's doing?
So the very first place is to go to company disclosure.
Right.
So companies have become much better at telling you how they're managing their risks, and that will include environmental and social risks.
Yeah.
So annual reports and accounts, corporate responsibility report, website. So really trying to assess, well, what are the risks of that company and how are they reporting? And the sorts of things you would expect to see are not just policies, but targets. So climate change, for instance, if you've got a carbon emission target in terms of reducing your CO2 intensity, or environmental impacts, making sure that you have a zero tolerance of spills, but you would expect companies to be reporting when they do have incidents. So there's a mantra, what is measured is managed. So if a company is measuring something, then you have more confidence that they're managing it. But that is not the only place to look for information. So the other places are the stakeholders that interact with that company. So it could be NGOs that might have a campaign against a company in certain regions of the world. It could be local stakeholders, it could be governments. It could also be things like industry bodies that they've signed up to. So sometimes you can see in the company says that it is really pro reducing carbon emissions and pro climate change, but the types of industry bodies that they have aligned to are very anti-climate change. So there's a disconnect there between what a company is saying and what it's doing. So starting point, the company and the company's report. But Google search articles, news articles about these companies. Look at NGO campaigns. And if there is a campaign, there's normally some research behind that you can dig into as well.
If you find information on the company's investor relations website, that's surely going to be the company presenting themselves in a good light and telling investors what they want to hear, isn't it? How do you double check that information?
That's a very good question, because particularly now companies are far more cognizant that they need to report and give a good face.
Yeah.
That is something. So it actually makes investors' task a bit harder now than it did, say, 10 years ago, where the companies that were reporting were the ones that were doing well, because they were actually addressing some of the issues. So as I've previously mentioned, thinking about websites, doing Google searches, looking at consumer activist campaigns. Another place to look, which I think is really interesting, is a site called Glassdoor. So Glassdoor is an organisation that allows any employee to write a review of the company that they are working for. So you can get positive Glassdoor responses and you can get negative Glassdoor responses. And as an investor, that's a really interesting tool to see what employees think about the companies that they're working for.
We hear a lot about greenwashing in the news, so it's basically companies pretending to do things that are environmentally beneficial and covering up the damaging things. Is this bad? And if so, how do we uncover this?
I think it is a problem. And this is where things like auditing play a really good role. So if a company chooses to have its corporate responsibility data audited, it means they've had an external person come in and actually say, yes, this data is valid from what we can see. So that's a good thing.
Yeah.
Reporting not just on your policies, but how you implement that and the results of that implementation. Again, digging into the details. So it's all very well saying, well, we love the environment, but actually you can also look and see how many fines that the company's had and those sorts of things. So you'd want to see a policy, you'd want to see a strategy to implement that policy, target setting from the company, and then reporting against its performance. And so if it's giving you very specific data points, that's really helpful, because it gives you some sort of assurance that actually they're doing more than they say they're doing. The other thing to look for are anomalies in that data. So health and safety, most companies will tell you what their health and safety figures are, but if you see spikes, like they're doing okay and then there's a spike one year in terms of incidents and then they're doing okay and there's another spike, it makes you have to question what's gone on that's created those spikes. Is it something fundamentally wrong with the company? So it's looking at trends, where the trends are. They going up, are they going down, and making sure that you kind of analyse the data that goes behind the reporting.
So COP26, what is it all about?
Yes, so you probably have heard lots in the news about COP26. So every year there is it's called the Conference of Parties, and it's a climate change conference, and governments around the world come together to set climate goals and agenda. This is a very significant COP because was meant to be 5 years after Paris, but obviously we've been delayed by a year. And the Paris Agreement was significant because it signed governments up to binding targets to reduce CO2 emissions. Now, for investors, the reason why that is important is because government legislation will drive where people are investing their money, but also B, what risks companies are facing. So with COP this year is significant because what they're expecting is more stringent commitments from the governments around the world towards achieving what we call a net zero by 2050. So in order for to keep CO2 emissions below, that's what we're aiming for, is net zero by 2050. So you'll see lots of governments making announcements. There'll be lots of negotiations happening within the blue zone, and then there's a green zone where lots of other interested parties will be hanging out to have discussions. So there are investors who will be there because we'll be talking about some of the solutions that we are providing for our clients around net zero, but you'll have companies there talking about what they're doing, and most importantly, you'll have governments there in a bid and a hope that they will actually make some firm commitments to reduce CO2 emissions.
So COP26 is coming up. How can investors put pressure on companies to make them more environmentally friendly?
So investors are already doing quite a lot in terms of engaging with the companies. So you might have heard the word engagement. Engagement is talking to management. Now, there are a number of different reasons why you would talk to company management. One is to find out more about what the company is doing and their strategy. And the second is to encourage better practice where you think perhaps they should be improving. So there are lots of investors engaging with carbon intensive companies at the moment around what carbon decarbonisation strategies they have. Are they committed to net zero 2050? If they are, what are they planning to do about it? And you can collaborate as a group of investors with companies on some of these topics, which we do. So the engagement is really important. The other thing you can do as an investor is think about aligning your portfolio more towards less carbon intensive companies in the bid that we want to phase out fossil fuels over time, and actually there are plenty of people who want more sustainability focused strategies as part of their investment portfolio. So it's not necessarily just about engagement. You can also use your choice in terms of the types of products that you invest in. Now, some people like transition companies. So what they mean by that is that they want to invest in a dirty company, but use their voice to get that company to change, because they feel as an activist investor, that's a really powerful thing to be able to do. So investors are already playing a part. They're creating different types of products and systems that can help analyze your portfolio in terms of carbon risks, but also engaging with the companies that we're investing in.
Great. Your job sounds fascinating. If we wanted to work in this area, what advice would you give us?
A, you've got to love and understand finance, and B, you've got to love and understand sustainability. I think the two can go hand in hand. I think I'm proof of that. But also really understanding the power that finance has to bring about positive change in the world. So there are, and it's become a bit of a trendy, hot area, sustainability. And there are a number of companies, I feel it comes back to your greenwashing point, that are doing this because they want to look cool and good and hop on a bandwagon. You've got to really want to achieve that change, and it needs to be fundamental to you as an individual. So, the finance sector as a whole is amazing, but sustainability within the finance sector, you've got to have a passion for doing the right thing, and you do sustainability which will make you money rather than choose sustainability to make money. There's a slight difference there. So I genuinely believe that by doing the right thing, you will do better for your clients over the longer term. And I think that fundamental belief, passion, desire to learn, great attitude, those are all the things that will get you on in the finance industry.
That's great, thank you.
Thanks so much, Amanda. I'm sure our teams will really find all that information very interesting. And it's been great talking to you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and good luck to all the ladies out there who are going to get involved in the competition.